In the span of a single dawn, the entire balance of power in West Africa shifted, and the West barely noticed until it was too late. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's military leader, had just orchestrated something that Paris never saw coming: a direct alliance with Guinea-Bissau's coup leadership that would fundamentally challenge everything Emmanuel Macron's France thought it controlled on the African continent. This wasn't a quiet, diplomatic maneuver. This was a declaration. For decades, the relationship between France and its former African colonies had followed a predictable script. Paris maintained influence through military bases, economic leverage, and the omnipresent threat of intervention. African leaders, even those who privately resented it, played along. The system worked because it was understood. But on that particular morning, as news of the alliance began to circulate through capitals from Dakar to Accra, it became clear that someone had finally decided the script needed to be rewritten. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't just the alliance itself. It's what the alliance represents: a coordinated awakening across the Sahel, a region that has long been treated as a pawn in global games of chess. Leaders like Traoré weren't making random moves. They were executing a carefully considered strategy that signaled something far larger: the beginning of genuine African sovereignty in one of the world's most strategically important regions. And the implications ripple far beyond West Africa's borders. To understand how we arrived at this stunning reversal, we need to travel back through time and understand the architecture of control that has defined the region for generations. We need to understand why one military leader's alliance with another coup movement represents not just a political shift, but a fundamental rejection of the post-colonial order that has shaped African politics for more than half a century. Let's start with the obvious question that few people are asking: why is the Sahel so important in the first place? The Sahel isn't just another African region. It's a critical belt of territory stretching across the continent from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, encompassing nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea-Bissau. The region sits at the intersection of everything that matters in 21st century geopolitics. It contains vast mineral resources, gold, uranium, rare earth elements, that power the technology and energy sectors of the developed world. It controls migration routes that affect Europe directly. It's become a battleground for influence between the United States, Russia, China, and a weakening France. And crucially, it's home to hundreds of millions of people who are finally waking up to the fact that they've been living under a system designed to extract their wealth while keeping them dependent on foreign powers. For the last 70 years, France has maintained an almost imperial grip on this region through what experts call neo-colonialism, a system where formal independence is granted, but economic and political control remains firmly in Paris's hands. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented, acknowledged, and remarkably brazen. France has military bases scattered throughout the Sahel. French companies control much of the region's most valuable resource extraction. The French military has conducted hundreds of airstrikes and operations across the region, ostensibly fighting terrorism, but in practice maintaining French interests and French influence. But here's where the story gets interesting. For years, this system functioned smoothly because African leaders, at least publicly, accepted it. They might complain privately. They might resent the economic arrangements, but they understood the cost of resistance. France had demonstrated repeatedly that it would intervene militarily to protect its interests. In 2011, France toppled Libya's Gaddafi, a leader who had dared to challenge French dominance. The message was clear: step out of line, and France will respond. Ibrahim Traoré entered the scene as something different. When he took power in Burkina Faso through a military coup in 2022, nobody expected what came next. Instead of quietly accepting the old arrangements, Traoré began dismantling them piece by piece. He ordered French military forces to leave. He expelled French diplomats. He terminated military cooperation agreements. He publicly criticized France's role in the region. Most shocking of all, he began reaching out to other African nations and to countries like Russia, establishing new partnerships that didn't come with French strings attached. The French establishment was stunned. President Macron, accustomed to African leaders who would ultimately bend to Paris's will, found himself dealing with a leader who simply refused to play the game. France responded by withdrawing its military presence, but not before making it clear that Burkina Faso would pay a price for its defiance. Economic pressure followed. Diplomatic isolation. The message from Paris was vicious: obey or be destroyed. But that's not the full story. Because while France was focused on punishing Traore, something far more significant was happening across the Sahel. Other leaders were watching. Other nations were taking note. And they were beginning to ask themselves the same question: what if we didn't have to accept this? What if there was actually power in unity? Enter Guinea-Bissau. This small West African nation had just experienced its own military upheaval, with a coup that signaled a dramatic shift in the country's political direction. The new leadership wasn't interested in maintaining the old colonial relationships. They were looking for allies who shared their vision of genuine African autonomy, and they found one in Ibrahim Traoré. When news of the alliance broke, it sent shockwaves through established diplomatic channels. This wasn't two random leaders making a friendship pact. This was a deliberate, calculated move to create a bloc of nations united against external interference. More importantly, it signaled to other leaders in the region that alternatives existed to the old power structures. It meant that a leader could reject France and not fall, could defy the Western order and survive, could chart an independent course and find support from neighbors. The alliance represented something almost revolutionary in African geopolitics: mutual support between nations pursuing parallel goals. Traore and Guinea-Bissau's leadership weren't just agreeing to trade or diplomatic recognition. They were signaling military coordination, intelligence sharing, and a commitment to defend each other against external pressure. They were building what amounts to a coalition of the willing, nations determined to reclaim sovereignty. Here's where things get interesting. Because the moment this alliance became public knowledge, it triggered a cascade effect across the region. Mali, already on a similar trajectory, strengthened its own ties to this emerging bloc. Niger, having also experienced military upheaval and sought independence from French control, found itself part of an expanding network. The Sahel was beginning to cohere as a unified force, and the traditional powers, France, the United States, and to some extent the European Union, suddenly found themselves facing something they hadn't anticipated: organized African resistance to their dominance. The Western response has been predictably panicked. France has increased military operations in the region, even as it officially withdrew troops. The United States has maintained its military presence while trying to negotiate with individual leaders. The European Union has issued statements about democratic concerns regarding the military governments in the region, statements that notably ignore Europe's own historical support for authoritarian regimes when it suited their interests. But the key insight here is that none of these traditional approaches seem to be working anymore, because Traore and the emerging Sahel bloc have discovered something that changes the entire equation. Alternatives exist. Russia has been eager to provide military support and training. China has been willing to engage in economic partnerships without the conditionality that Western powers demand. African nations have been willing to coordinate with each other in ways that Western analysts simply didn't anticipate. What makes the Traore-Guinea-Bissau alliance particularly significant is its symbolism. It demonstrates that African leaders are no longer isolated actors competing with each other for scraps of Western approval. They're beginning to act as a coordinated bloc with shared interests. They're beginning to understand that their greatest source of leverage isn't in accepting the old arrangements. It's in unity and in refusing those arrangements outright. The citizens of the Sahel have watched this transformation with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For generations, they've been told that their nations are weak, that they need foreign protection, that they couldn't possibly manage without external guidance. Then came leaders like Traore, who looked at that narrative and rejected it entirely, who said, "We are strong enough. We are sovereign enough. We will decide our own future." The response from ordinary people across the region has been remarkable. Expressions of pride, of hope that perhaps a new era truly was beginning. The alliance also carries enormous implications for how Africa's future will be organized. If nations in the Sahel successfully coordinate their responses to external pressure, if they successfully maintain their sovereignty despite Western attempts to undermine them, then the entire model of African dependence on external powers collapses. Other regions might follow. Other African leaders might feel emboldened to pursue similar courses. The post-colonial world order, which has held for nearly a century, could be fundamentally transformed. But let's not oversimplify this. Because for all the hopeful rhetoric from supporters, this realignment carries genuine risks. The Sahel is already one of the world's most unstable regions, afflicted by terrorism, insurgency, and profound economic challenges. Disrupting the existing international arrangements, even if those arrangements were unjust, creates space for chaos. Military governments, while sometimes more willing to defy foreign pressure, don't have a perfect track record of governing effectively or democratically. The citizens celebrating this moment of defiance should also be realistic about the challenges that lie ahead. Moreover, the alliance doesn't exist in a vacuum. France isn't the only power with interests in the region. The United States has maintained a significant military presence, ostensibly fighting terrorism, but also maintaining strategic influence. Russia, while supportive of the defiant rhetoric, has its own strategic calculations and may not prove to be the selfless ally that some hope for. China, while engaging economically, is pursuing its own long-term interests. The Sahel may have rejected one form of external control, but that doesn't mean it has escaped the global competition for influence. It has simply shifted that competition. The economic dimensions of this shift are also crucial. France benefits enormously from its relationships with Sahel nations. They provide markets, resources, and strategic positions. When those relationships rupture, both sides suffer economically. Traore's Burkina Faso, despite its defiant posture, has experienced economic contraction, not expansion, following its break with France. The citizens who celebrated the alliance must also deal with the economic consequences of severing relationships that, however exploitative, also provided certain forms of stability and investment. This is where the narrative becomes more complex than simple liberation mythology. Yes, the old order was unjust and exploitative. Yes, African nations deserve genuine sovereignty. But the transition to that sovereignty is messy, complicated, and filled with risks. It requires not just the will to reject foreign control, but the capacity to build functional alternatives. It requires strong institutions, economic development, and social cohesion, all things that are difficult to achieve in any context, and particularly difficult in regions already facing serious challenges. What's truly remarkable about the Traore Guinea-Bissau alliance, then, isn't that it represents a perfect solution or a guaranteed path to African prosperity. It's that it represents a moment of genuine choice. For perhaps the first time in living memory, African leaders are exercising agency in a way that feels authentic. They're not simply accepting the global order as it's been handed to them. They're actively working to reshape it in ways that serve their own interests and those of their peoples. The whispers of secret military coordination, the speculation about strategic alliances, the commitment to anti-interference policies, these aren't just gossip or conspiracy theories. They're the sound of a region reorganizing itself. They're evidence that the old assumptions about who has power and who doesn't are being challenged. They're proof that even in a world dominated by powerful states and multinational corporations, alternatives can emerge when people and leaders decide to pursue them collectively. The supporters of this movement see it as historic. And in many ways, they're right. A coordinated rejection of neo-colonialism by multiple nations in the same region, supported by their populations, would be genuinely transformative. It would set a precedent. It would demonstrate that change is possible. It would show other regions of the world that the existing power structures, while entrenched and powerful, are not immovable. The critics, meanwhile, worry about the deeper implications. They fear that the political instability resulting from this shift could create space for extremism to flourish. They worry that economic disruption could cause suffering for ordinary citizens. They worry that without the stabilizing force of traditional international relationships, the region could descend into chaos. These concerns aren't irrational. They're based on genuine risks that should be taken seriously. But perhaps the most important question isn't whether the alliance will succeed perfectly or whether it will create new problems. Perhaps the crucial question is whether it represents an irreversible shift in how African nations see themselves and their place in the world. Because if it does, if a new generation of African leaders has genuinely internalized the idea that they don't have to accept external domination, that they can chart independent courses, that they can find strength and unity with their neighbors, then something fundamental has changed, regardless of the specific outcomes of any particular policy or agreement. The geopolitical order has been shifting for decades. The rise of China, the relative decline of Western influence, the emergence of new power centers. These trends have been visible for years. But the Sahel Alliance suggests something more specific: the direct assertion of non-Western nations to shape their own futures without waiting for permission or approval from traditional powers. It's an assertion that could inspire similar movements elsewhere. Consider the implications beyond the Sahel. Latin American nations, tired of American interventionism. Southeast Asian countries, seeking to balance between China and the West. Eastern European nations, reconsidering their relationships with both Europe and Russia. If the model that emerges from the Sahel, coordinated regional power, rejection of external dominance, strategic independence, proves viable, it could spread. It could reshape the global order in ways that established powers are only beginning to comprehend. This is why what happens in the Sahel over the next few years matters not just for West Africa, but for the trajectory of global politics. This is why the alliance between Traore's Burkina Faso and Guinea-Bissau's new leadership represents more than just a local development. It's a test case. It's a demonstration project. It's proof of concept for a world organized differently than the one we've known for the last several decades. The citizens of the Sahel, watching this unfold, understand the stakes intuitively. They've lived their entire lives in a world where their nation's destinies were determined largely by external powers. They've watched resources extracted, decisions made in foreign capitals affecting their lives, their countries treated as pieces on someone else's chessboard. The alliance represents a moment where they get to write a different script, where they get to imagine that their nations could be genuinely theirs. Whether that imagination becomes reality, whether the alliance can translate hopeful sentiment into actual development and security and prosperity, remains to be seen. The challenges ahead are enormous. The forces arrayed against fundamental change are powerful. The risk of failure is genuine, but something has shifted. The assumption that the old order is permanent, that African nations must accept external dominance, that the post-colonial world will continue indefinitely as it has. That assumption has been broken. And once that assumption is broken, everything becomes possible. The region may struggle. It may face setbacks, but it will do so as a region actively working to determine its own fate, rather than passively accepting one handed down from elsewhere. As dawn breaks over the Sahel, a new chapter is being written. Whether it becomes the great liberation story that supporters envision, or whether it becomes a cautionary tale about the costs of transition, that remains to be determined. But one thing is certain: the West's unquestioned dominance in this region has ended. The question now is what replaces it. The answer to that question will help determine not just the future of the Sahel, but the shape of the entire global order in the decades to come. And that's why this moment matters so much more than most people realize.